A grizzly bear's claws scratched at the door, desperate to break through. But the man inside wasn't afraid. He had built something stronger than the wilderness itself, a cabin that even the fiercest predators couldn't breach. This was no ordinary structure. It was a fortress in the heart of the Rockies, created by a mountain man who had learned the hardest way possible. Survival meant innovation. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love tales of survival and frontier ingenuity, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The snow had come early that year, and Samuel could feel it deep in his bones. The mountain wind howled like a beast on the prowl, chilling to the marrow and driving the snow sideways in a white fury. He'd been through these winters before, but this year, something felt different. The biting cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat. Samuel stood in the doorway of his new cabin, eyeing the horizon, where dark clouds threatened more than just a storm. His breath formed a cloud in the frigid air as he adjusted the heavy woolen cloak around his shoulders, feeling the sharp sting of the wind creep under his layers. He ran his hands over the rough log walls, sturdy and strong, the product of months of grueling work. The cabin was a fortress, but it was more than just a shelter. It was the culmination of a year's worth of obsession. Unlike the makeshift shelters of other trappers, Samuel's cabin was built with a method that he'd painstakingly perfected. The walls were double-layered, with air trapped in between for insulation, and each log was fitted so precisely that no draft could seep through. It was more than just walls. It was a design, a revolution in frontier construction that could keep out the harshest of elements, and today it would face its first real test. His rifle hung loosely at his side, not out of carelessness but readiness. The bear had been circling his cabin for days now, leaving fresh tracks in the snow. Each time it had come closer, scratching at the logs, testing the door, and sniffing the air with an intelligence that made Samuel uneasy. He had heard the stories of cabins torn apart by the sheer force of a determined grizzly. But Samuel wasn't just another trapper. He had built something that no bear could break. The heavy thud of a paw landing in the snow outside snapped him from his thoughts. The bear was here. Again. He stood still, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature was big, huge, and as it circled the cabin, its claws scrapped against the logs, testing for weaknesses. Samuel knew it would not give up easily, but he didn't flinch. He had faith in his work. And then, just as quickly as it had arrived, the bear moved off, satisfied that the fortress was impenetrable. It had left without even attempting to break in. Samuel's chest eased as the bear's tracks faded into the white expanse. He had done it. He had built something that could withstand the mountain's most dangerous adversary. But this was only the beginning. The grizzly's visit was more than just a test of his cabin. It was a challenge to Samuel's very way of life. In the coming months, others would see what he had built, and some would come asking questions that Samuel had already answered with his blood, sweat, and the design of his cabin. The wind had died down by the time Samuel set out to meet his partner, John Hoffman. They had spent a month trapping in these unforgiving mountains, making a decent haul of pelts, but the wilderness had already begun to reveal its dangers. It was a risk most mountain men accepted until it came for them. Samuel's cabin was still new, and although he had done his best to perfect his design, it was still unfinished. As he trudged through the snow to meet John, he felt a nagging sense that something wasn't right. The air felt colder, as if the very mountain was watching, waiting for something to go wrong. When he reached the point where he had last seen John, he found his partner's rifle lying in the snow. 3 shots, rapid fire, then silence. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed his own rifle and rushed to the sound, his legs burning as he pushed through the snowdrifts. When he found John, the sight hit him like a punch to the gut. The man was lying in a heap, his face a mask of pain, blood soaking through his coat where the grizzly's claws had torn into him. Samuel dropped to his knees beside his partner, his heart pounding in his chest. "John, no!" The bear had attacked without warning, probably while John was checking the trap lines near a beaver dam. John had fired his rifle, but it had been a desperate shot, not enough to slow the beast. The grizzly had killed him with terrifying efficiency. There were no words for the horror of it, no reason that made sense. Samuel stayed by John's side long enough to bury him, marking the grave with a pile of stones before returning to the cabin alone. That night, as the wind howled and the cold seeped into his bones, Samuel lay awake in his bed. The cabin was meant to protect him, but now, with John dead, it felt like a tomb. The walls, his walls, had failed him. The very thing that was supposed to keep him safe had proven to be vulnerable. The cold realization set in. No amount of trapper's luck or hard work could keep out a bear if the cabin itself wasn't built to last. That night, a plan was born. Samuel didn't sleep. He couldn't. As the snow piled up outside, he sat in the flickering light of his cabin's fire, thinking only of one thing: how to make his home impenetrable. What would follow would change the course of his life and the lives of many others in the wilderness. But first, he would have to rebuild everything he thought he knew about survival. In the weeks that followed John's death, Samuel became a man possessed. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. The memory of his partner's lifeless body haunted him, and it wasn't just the grizzly's attack that gnawed at him. It was the realization that he had been unprepared. Samuel spent his days in a daze, trapping and working, but his mind was always elsewhere. When he was alone in the mountains, he would sit at the edge of the fire, staring into the flames, trying to puzzle out a solution. How could he make a cabin that could withstand the fury of the wilderness? By day, he noticed everything. He saw how other trappers' cabins stood against the elements, and more importantly, how they failed. The wooden doors, the rough-hewn walls, it wasn't enough. A grizzly could tear through a cabin in minutes, but it was more than just bears. The wind howled through the gaps in the logs, snow piled up in corners, and even the strongest walls buckled under the weight of the season. But it wasn't just about the bears. Samuel began to understand the profound role a cabin played in the survival of a man in the wilderness. It wasn't just a shelter from the cold. It was a stronghold, a place to rest, to sleep, and to regain the strength needed to face the challenges of the mountains. His cabin had failed him once, and he vowed it wouldn't happen again. He thought back to the other cabins he had seen, how they had been hastily constructed, with uneven logs and gaps between them. The corners were weak. The roofs leaked. Samuel knew he could do better. He spent the next few days taking detailed measurements of his own cabin, mapping out every weak point, every flaw. He studied the logs, examining their placement, considering how he could reinforce them. The door was his first concern. It was too thin, too simple. But it wasn't just the door. It was everything. He would need to rethink the entire structure. Over the next few weeks, as the harsh winter snowed in the valley, Samuel ventured out to see other trappers' cabins. He found abandoned structures with doors ripped off their hinges and corners torn apart. He listened to the stories of men who had survived bear attacks, piecing together their experiences to understand how the bears had broken in. There was a pattern, a method to the chaos of nature's fury. Bears would test the doors first, then the corners, then the gaps in the walls. They were patient, intelligent creatures, and Samuel knew that to survive, his cabin would need to outsmart them. But Samuel was no carpenter. He wasn't a trained architect. He was just a trapper with a stubborn streak and a mountain of grief pushing him forward. Still, he didn't care. He would figure it out. It wasn't enough to merely survive. Samuel had to ensure he would never lose anyone again. The mountains had taken John, and they had nearly taken Samuel's life too, but he would not let them win. The days passed, and with each one, Samuel's resolve grew, stronger. He had the knowledge now, the quiet whisper of intuition mixed with the hard-earned lessons of the wilderness. He would build a cabin unlike any other, one that could withstand everything the frontier could throw at it. And he would start by focusing on the one thing that had betrayed him, the cabin's walls. The time had come. Samuel could no longer stay in the mountains, surrounded by memories of John, while his plans for the cabin were nothing more than sketches on the back of old trapping receipts. It was time to make the long journey to St. Louis. He needed to buy the materials, the iron, the tools, the supplies that would make his vision a reality. The trip was a grueling one, made even harder by the deep snow and biting cold. Samuel packed light, taking only what he absolutely needed for the journey. He knew that the fur trade was winding down in these parts, and the markets in St. Louis would be his best chance at securing the materials he needed. But it wasn't just about the supplies, it was about finding something more. Samuel needed to learn. He wasn't an educated man, but the people in St. Louis had knowledge he didn't. Builders, craftsmen, carpenters, men who knew the art of construction. Samuel needed to watch them, learn their methods, and take back whatever insights would help him build the cabin of his dreams. The journey was long, and by the time Samuel reached St. Louis, the winter winds had made him as tired and weathered as the old trees that stood like sentinels along the trail. He stayed in a modest inn for a week, recovering from the journey. His muscles ached from the constant battle with the snow, and the cold seemed to have seeped into his bones, but there was no time to waste. Samuel spent his days in the bustling streets of St. Louis, visiting warehouses, speaking to carpenters, and examining the buildings in the city. Everywhere he looked, he saw new techniques, new tools and materials he hadn't considered. Brick buildings with interlocking walls, strong reinforced door frames, massive iron hinges. He spent hours watching carpenters working on warehouses, paying close attention to the joints and beams they used. He studied how they reinforced the corners, how the weight of the building was distributed. It was a strange thing for a mountain man to be doing, wandering through the streets of a city, observing carpenters, taking notes. But Samuel didn't care. This was his mission, his obsession. He had to learn everything he could. The mountains, the wilderness, the bears, they didn't care about him being a trapper. They didn't care about his life or his legacy. He had to build something that could stand against them. By the end of the week, Samuel had acquired more than just materials. He had gathered knowledge that would shape the future of mountain cabins forever. He wasn't just learning about construction, he was absorbing the very principles of strength and resilience that would make his cabin a true fortress. But as Samuel made his way back to the mountains, the snow began to fall once more. The world seemed to close in around him, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of the work that lay ahead. The journey had been long, but the real battle had just begun. The materials were ready. The plan was set. Now it was time to build. When Samuel returned to the mountain valley, the cold had settled into the bones of the land. The snows that had threatened earlier in the year were now a constant presence, blanketing everything in sight with thick layers of white. It was the kind of winter that seemed to test every man who dared live in the wilderness. Samuel knew he was about to test the mountain itself. He had his materials now, the iron nails, the thick planks, the square-cut iron brackets, and most importantly, the knowledge he had gained in St. Louis. But before he could even think about the walls or the roof, he needed to lay a foundation that would anchor everything he built to the ground and keep it from succumbing to the shifting earth. It was a concept that many of the other trappers couldn't understand. The notion of a foundation beyond the rough logs that formed a simple floor seemed unnecessary. A cabin was just a place to sleep, to shelter from the storms, but Samuel knew better. A cabin wasn't just a roof and four walls. It was the first line of defense against the wilderness. Without a solid foundation, nothing else would matter, and the cold, shifting ground would eat away at the very heart of his creation. Samuel began with a trench, cutting deep into the frozen earth around the perimeter of his cabin site. It was slow work, made all the more difficult by the bitter cold that cut through his thick coat and chilled him to the marrow. He cursed the frost as he dug, but he never stopped. The trench was to be filled with rocks, stones he had gathered from the riverbed a few miles up the creek. They were heavy, but they were perfect for the job. The stones would hold the weight of the structure and prevent the logs from settling or shifting over time. The work was grueling, but Samuel didn't care. He had been through worse. His mind was focused on the task, and his hands moved with a precision born of necessity. He spent days digging and hauling rocks, shaping the trench until it was just right. By the time he was finished, the trench was filled and the foundation was solid. His back ached, his fingers were raw from the cold, but he knew that this foundation would make all the difference. It wasn't just about the stones. It was about the way they were arranged, the way they would distribute the weight of the cabin evenly across the ground. It was the first step in ensuring that this cabin, this fortress, would withstand the test of time, the elements, and anything the wilderness could throw at it. That night, as he sat in front of his fire, Samuel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The foundation was complete. But he knew that the real work was just beginning. The walls would come next, and they had to be perfect. Every log would have to be carefully chosen and cut, each corner precisely joined. No mistakes could be made. The pressure was immense, but Samuel had made a promise to himself. This cabin would be stronger than any that had come before it. It would be a refuge, a true home in the wilderness. With the foundation in place, the next step was to raise the walls. For Samuel, this was where the true test of his design would begin. The walls weren't just about keeping the wind out, they were about strength, about structure. If the foundation was the heart of the cabin, the walls were its bones. Samuel had already spent weeks studying the trees that surrounded his cabin site, carefully selecting the logs he would use for the walls. He rejected any logs that were crooked or tapered, knowing they wouldn't fit tightly and would create weak points. He needed straight, sturdy logs that would fit together with minimal gaps. The work was back-breaking. Each log had to be cut, stripped of bark, and shaped with a draw knife, a tool that Samuel had become very familiar with during his years of trapping. The process was slow and meticulous. Samuel worked from sunup to sundown, hauling logs to the cabin site one by one. As he began stacking the logs, he noticed how the corners of the cabin seemed to take shape. Unlike the traditional method of notching the logs at the corners, Samuel had decided to take a different approach. He used a technique he had seen in the stone buildings of St. Louis, extending the logs past the corners by 2 feet and then driving iron pins through them. It was a design that would eliminate the weak points that bears had exploited in the past. The walls rose slowly, each log carefully placed to ensure the cabin was sturdy. Samuel could feel the weight of the structure growing, but he didn't flinch. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when all his hard work, his grief, and his obsession would come together. The first day the walls began to rise, Samuel stood back for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked at the structure taking shape, knowing it was unlike anything any other trapper had built before. The walls were thick and solid, with no gaps between the logs. The air between the layers would act as insulation, trapping heat in the winter and keeping the cold out. It was a design that Samuel had dreamed of, one that would protect him from the brutal elements of the mountains. By the end of the second day, the walls were nearly complete. Samuel's arms ached, his back screamed in protest, but he felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't known since he first decided to build this cabin. Each log, each pin, each piece of iron had been placed with purpose and care. He wasn't just building a cabin, he was building a legacy. As night fell and the wind picked up outside, Samuel took a moment to survey his work. The walls stood tall and firm, a testament to his vision and determination. The storm raged outside, but inside his cabin, Samuel felt a sense of peace. The work was far from over, but the foundation was set and the walls were solid. The next challenge would be the roof, but for now, he allowed himself a brief respite. The wilderness had tested him, and he had come through stronger for it. But even as he settled into his bed that night, Samuel knew that this cabin was not just a place of refuge for him. It would be the beginning of something greater. With the walls finally standing tall and firm, Samuel turned his attention to the roof. The wind howled outside, and the mountain seemed to settle deeper into its wintry slumber. The air was sharp, cutting to the bone, but Samuel hardly noticed. He was determined to finish what he had started, and the roof was his next hurdle. Unlike the walls, which had been a labor of careful precision, the roof would require a different kind of thinking. It wasn't just about strength. It was about weathering the storms that could sweep through the valley. Samuel knew that in these parts, a roof wasn't just something to protect you from rain or snow. It had to withstand the weight of the snow itself, the crushing weight that could easily collapse a poorly built structure. And more than that, it had to be able to shed rain and snow without leaking into the cabin, keeping the interior dry and warm. Samuel had seen many roofs over the years, and the standard cabin roof was always flimsy. Made from a mixture of poles and bark or sod, they leaked in heavy rain and couldn't withstand the force of a falling tree. But Samuel wasn't going to settle for anything less than perfection. He began by selecting thick, sturdy logs for the ridgepole. These would serve as the backbone of the roof, spanning the width of the cabin. The logs were carefully notched so they fit perfectly, creating a strong frame that would hold up the weight of the roof and the snow that would inevitably accumulate during the harsh winter months. The next task was to lay the planks across the ridgepole. Samuel chose the best available wood for this, hand-selecting each piece for its strength and flatness. He didn't trust the flimsy bark roofs most trappers used. He needed something more substantial. He laid the planks in overlapping layers, each layer covering the gaps of the one below, much like the shingles on a well-built roof. Once the planks were in place, he pegged them securely to the ridgepole with wooden pegs he whittled himself. It was slow work, but every piece had to be perfect. With the wooden base laid, Samuel then turned his attention to the final layer, the bark. He gathered thick birch bark from the nearby trees, knowing that it would be both waterproof and flexible. The layers of bark were placed over the planks, overlapping to form a seal that would keep out the rain and snow. But Samuel wasn't finished yet. He knew that the bark, while effective, wouldn't be enough to protect the roof from the weight of the snow. He needed something more. After thinking for a while, Samuel decided to add a final layer of clay mixture, a combination of horsehair, pine resin, and clay that he had used for the walls. This mixture would bond to the bark and form a hard, waterproof surface that would hold up to the snow's pressure. By the time the roof was complete, Samuel felt a deep satisfaction. The cabin was becoming the fortress he had imagined. The layers of materials, wood, bark, clay, created a roof that was strong, waterproof, and capable of withstanding the harshest conditions the mountain could throw at it. That night, as he lay in his bed, the howling wind outside no longer seemed as threatening. The cabin, with its sturdy walls and roof, felt like a sanctuary. Samuel had done what he set out to do. He had built something that would protect him from the wilderness. But even as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that the final piece of the puzzle, the door, still awaited his attention. The roof was complete, but Samuel's work wasn't finished. There was still the matter of the door, and for Samuel, this was no ordinary task. A door wasn't just an entryway, it was the final line of defense, the last thing that stood between him and the wilderness. If the bears couldn't break through the walls, they might try the door, and if the door wasn't up to his standards, then all the work he had done up until that point would be for nothing. He had watched other trappers' doors, simple, flimsy structures with poorly secured hinges, easily pried open or torn off by a bear. But Samuel wasn't like most trappers. He had spent too many nights thinking about this moment, and he had a vision for the door that would make his cabin impenetrable. The first step was to select the wood. Samuel chose the densest, strongest planks he could find, carefully cutting them to size and shaping them with his draw knife. The planks were thick, nearly 3 inches thick, and each one was shaped to fit tightly together with no gaps between them. The process was slow, but Samuel didn't mind. This door had to be perfect. Next, he turned his attention to the construction method. While most trappers used simple wooden bars or cross pieces to secure their doors, Samuel decided on something more robust. He began by creating a tongue and groove joint for the planks, a technique he had learned while observing the craftsmen in St. Louis. Each plank had a groove cut along one edge and a protruding tongue on the other. When the planks were assembled, they interlocked to create a single, solid piece of wood, but that wasn't enough. Samuel wanted to reinforce the door, so he added an X-shaped pattern of iron brackets across the inside. These brackets were mounted diagonally, with each one bolted through the planks using square-cut nails. The result was a door that was not only thick and solid, but also reinforced in a way that would make it impossible to tear apart. Samuel wasn't finished yet. He wanted the door to be as secure as possible, so he mortised the hinges directly into the door and the log frame, using iron pins to secure them. The hinges were not merely attached, they were integrated into the structure itself. This meant that anyone or anything trying to force the door open would not only have to deal with the heavy weight of the door, but also with the iron pins that held it in place. Finally, Samuel added a sophisticated locking mechanism. He used a thick wooden beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets mounted on the door and into a mortise in the log wall. This beam could be locked from the inside, making it impossible for anything to break through without destroying the entire wall. The locking mechanism was simple, but it was also foolproof. Only someone who knew exactly how it worked could unlock it. As Samuel finished the door, he stepped back to admire his work. It was a masterpiece, a door that could withstand anything the wilderness or a grizzly could throw at it. With the door in place, his cabin was complete. That night, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled up around his cabin, Samuel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The cabin was everything he had dreamed of, and more. It was a refuge from the dangers of the wilderness, a fortress built from the lessons of survival and the need for innovation. But even as he settled into his bed, listening to the storm rage outside, Samuel knew that the cabin was more than just a home. It was a legacy. And the world would soon come to see that this mountain man had built something truly extraordinary. Winter had tightened its grip on the mountains. The snow now blanketed the ground in thick, unforgiving layers, and the wind howled like a living creature, rattling the walls of Samuel's cabin. But inside there was warmth. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the log walls. Samuel stood in front of the window, peering out through the small, reinforced opening he had built. The storm raged outside, but within the cabin he felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced since John's death. For the first time since he began this project, Samuel felt at peace. His cabin, his fortress, was complete. It was everything he had hoped for, strong, durable, and capable of withstanding the harshest conditions. He had created a place that could survive anything, a place where he could rest, recover, and survive the brutal winters of the Rocky Mountains. But even as he admired his work, Samuel knew that no construction could truly be tested until it faced the very forces it was meant to endure. That was the reason he built it, because survival in the wilderness wasn't a guarantee, no matter how much preparation a man put into it. The wilderness had a way of humbling a man, and Samuel knew that the ultimate test had yet to come. It came sooner than expected. A few days after the roof had been completed, Samuel was out setting traps when he noticed fresh tracks near his cabin. Large tracks, the kind that told a story of a creature that had come very close. A grizzly based on the size of the print. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. The bear that had been circling the cabin for days had returned, and this time it seemed determined to get in. The tracks led right up to the cabin. Samuel approached carefully, rifle in hand, and stood watching for a long while, eyes trained on the door. The bear was out there, somewhere, prowling the woods with intent. It would test his defenses as it had in the past. Samuel had no doubt about that. As night fell, he returned to the cabin, his eyes never leaving the shadows outside. The wind howled again, but this time it wasn't just the wind. Samuel could hear something else. A heavy thud, followed by a guttural growl. The bear was here. He could feel it in the ground beneath his feet. The bear circled the cabin, pushing against the door, scratching at the walls. Samuel stood motionless, his breath slow and controlled. He knew what was coming. He had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since John's death. Now the cabin would prove its worth. Minutes passed, but the bear didn't give up. It clawed at the door, testing every inch of it. Samuel, inside, watched through a gun port he had designed to remain unseen, waiting for the moment when the bear would decide to leave or break through. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, the bear paused, sniffing the air. It scratched at the logs once more, testing them, but finally, with a snort, it gave up and wandered back into the wilderness. Samuel breathed a sigh of relief. He had built it. It had worked. The grizzly had tested his cabin to its limits and failed. But as the storm raged outside, Samuel knew that the test was not over. The wilderness was always out there, waiting for another opportunity to challenge him. But for tonight, for this moment, Samuel knew he had built something that would stand the test of time. As winter dragged on, the storm outside never seemed to stop. The snow piled higher, and the wind kept its relentless howl. But Samuel's cabin stood firm against the cold. The roof, the walls, and the door all held steady, protecting him from the fierce forces of the wilderness. The fire inside crackled as Samuel sat at the table, a mug of hot coffee in his hands, staring into the flames. He had survived. More than that, he had thrived. The cabin he had built had done exactly what he had hoped it would. It had kept the wilderness at bay, offering him the sanctuary he needed. The mountain had tested him, but in the end, Samuel had been victorious. In the months that followed, word began to spread through the trappers' community. Men who had heard of his work or seen it with their own eyes started seeking him out. Samuel had built something that had never been seen before, something that could withstand the grizzly, the harsh winters, and everything else the wilderness could throw at it. Some laughed at him, called him a fool for wasting so much time. But others, the ones who had faced the dangers firsthand, began to ask questions. How had he built it? What made it so strong? And more importantly, could they learn from him? Samuel shared his knowledge freely. He wasn't interested in keeping secrets. He was more concerned with survival. If other men could learn from his work, then perhaps they too could build something that would protect them. His techniques spread through the Rocky Mountain trapping community like wildfire. Some men adopted his methods, and others adapted them for their own needs. The Bridger-style cabins began to take shape all over the region. The impact of his work reached farther than Samuel could ever have imagined. As the fur trade began to wane and the mountain men slowly made their way out of the wilderness, settlers moving westward discovered the cabins Samuel had built, or those that were built using his methods. They were sturdy, reliable, and could withstand the wilds of the frontier. Many of these cabins remained standing for decades, long after Samuel had left the mountains. Samuel himself eventually left the wilderness in 1844, his years as a trapper behind him. He had made enough money to buy a small ranch in Oregon, where he married and started a family. The grizzly had taken his partner John, but it had not taken Samuel's spirit. He had built something that would outlast him, something that would stand as a testament to his determination, his ingenuity, and his love for the land that had both tested and shaped him. Samuel Bridger died in 1871, surrounded by his family on his Oregon ranch. His gravestone made no mention of the mountain man life he had lived or the fortress he had built, but his legacy remained in the mountains he had called home, in the cabins that still stood, weathered but unyielding, protecting new generations from the very dangers he had faced. Samuel had created more than a cabin. He had created a legacy that would live on long after he was gone. It was a legacy of innovation, survival, and the unyielding belief that, with enough determination, a single man could build something that could withstand even the most impossible odds.